Police Scotland is currently investigating a £600,000 independence fund that was raised from donations from party members for the cause of independence, and there's been complaints alleging that this has been spent in other areas. While all this was happening, there was this strange situation where Peter Murrell, her husband and the SNP chief executive, gave a loan of £107,000 to the SNP because it was facing a bit of a cash crisis. So the opponents are saying that this is all murky business, murky finances, and there was every possibility that Nicola Sturgeon and her husband may be or may even have been interviewed by police over this.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. I'd absolutely love it if you could hit that little subscribe button and the notification bell that sits right next to it there if you enjoy today's content. It actually helps ensure that you don't miss out on any future content, with YouTube notifying you on any future uploads. And folks, times are hard, we all know that, but if you're fortunate enough to be in a position to support Reason's work, ensuring that we can keep our independent voices online, we'd be very thankful indeed. Now, on this week's show, Nicola Sturgeon has been First Minister of Scotland since 2014 and its Deputy First Minister before that from 2007. She's well known throughout the whole of the United Kingdom and has been somewhat of a presidential figure, a tartan titan, if you will, throughout her time in Scotland's devolved administration's top job. So now that she's announced her resignation, what comes next for Scotland? What next for the Scottish National Party and, of course, its raison d'etre, its push for Scottish independence? And what is Nicola Sturgeon's legacy? Has she been a successful politician? She's certainly been electorally successful, but can we say she's been successful as far as policy outcomes are concerned? And who, if anyone, are the natural successors, given, as I say, that tartan titan has been somewhat of a, one-woman band? So I'm delighted to say that joining me to discuss all of these things is I can think of no one better, actually, Scotland's political editor of the Scottish Daily Mail, Michael Blackley. Thank you very much, Michael, for your company today.
No problem. Good to see you.
Now, Michael, you've just attended, or you are currently attending, Scottish Labour Conference, I believe. Now, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Sawa, has not exactly been the same towering figure, I think you would say it's perfectly fair to suggest, as Nicola Sturgeon was, or indeed even still is. But I do think, and I say that through gritted teeth, by the way, because Nicola Sturgeon has undeniably been a very successful politician, even if I would argue that the policy outcomes of her time in office haven't been great. Do you think Scottish Labour can actually capitalise on this unfrozen moment in Scottish politics? Is that what you're hearing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the announcement this week from Nicola Sturgeon that she is resigning really sent shockwaves through British politics. And I was at Scottish Labour conference, and in Anas Sarwar's speech, he was very upbeat. It was quite a optimistic, confident speech. And even before Nicola Sturgeon resigned, Labour were actually quite confident of winning a number of seats from the SNP, winning back some of the voters that they lost to the SNP in the past. They had 15 seats targeted in Scotland where they thought they at least stood a chance of victory against the SNP. And following Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, they are now saying that they think that number has gone up. So it's more than 15 now that they think they can win. So there's absolutely no doubt that Nicola Sturgeon, as you said, was extremely good at winning elections, extremely good at maximising the number of SNP seats. And without her, you do wonder whether some of the failings in domestic policy might come to the fore a bit more than they did while Nicola Sturgeon was the SNP leader.
And I wonder then, does the dynamic change in as far as the Conservatives are concerned, the Scottish Conservatives, but the whole of the United Kingdom as well? Do you think Boris being gone, Because a lot of cabinet members, for example, who backed Boris Johnson would have said things like, Boris is great for Brexit, but I worry that he's not so good for the union. With Boris being gone and Rishi Sunak being Prime Minister, of course, Rishi Sunak stood opposed to Nicola Sturgeon's gender ID reforms and actually blocked them. Do you think this changes things? Do you think the Scottish Conservatives can't easily be discounted now that Boris Johnson is out of the equation?
Yes, I mean, Boris Johnson was a problem for the Scottish Conservatives. The Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross, had repeatedly called for him to resign. It wasn't a good relationship that they had, although there are some in the Conservative Party, incidentally, that think that Boris could have been a bit more of an asset in Scotland than he was used as. But certainly, Nicola Sturgeon's departure, it'll be interesting in terms of the Conservatives because I think Nicola Sturgeon being First Minister was almost good for the Conservative vote in Scotland because they really maximised the anti SNP, anti Nicola Sturgeon vote, and that's quite a big catchment. So that's largely where their success came from. So I think what you need to see from the Scottish Conservatives now is perhaps trying to widen their appeal slightly. They can certainly claim to be the most strongly pro-union party, but I think they maybe need to go a little bit beyond that in order to win more of the vote than they have been winning. They have been doing well, but I think to maximise the vote, they need to do something a little bit new, perhaps.
Now, Scottish Labour actually backed those radical gender ID reforms, right? I mean, the Lib Dems, I believe, had a free vote on the issue. Now, I wonder, Michael, to what extent, I guess there are two questions from that. Can anyone that backed them in the Scottish Parliament, leading to the kind of rows that we've seen that you've no doubt covered over recent weeks over the Isla Bryson or Adam Graham, the double rapist that was placed in a female prison, can anyone who voted for those reforms remain unscathed from the whole affair? Because I think it's fair to say they are deeply unpopular reforms, not just in England, but in Scotland too. Do you think that the whole saga may have ultimately as well played a role in Sturgeon's resignation?
Yes, absolutely. I think Nicola Sturgeon said that it was nothing to do with recent events that she had resigned, but she did also say that she had been coming to her decision over recent weeks. And we know that there has been a real crisis in recent weeks over this issue in particular. So I think it has to have been a factor because we have this strange situation in the Scottish Parliament where the views of the Scottish public weren't really reflected in the Scottish Parliament because the Conservatives were the only party that were really against the gender reforms, and that just doesn't reflect the Scottish public at all. I mean, the polling on this subject shows that they were deeply unpopular. The particular cases that you mentioned, there was a public outcry about it. And I think what we saw with Nicola Sturgeon was this somebody who's regarded as a skilled politician at reflecting the public mood. Well, she got it completely wrong on this issue. And we've seen her backtracking, we've seen her U-turning on some of the policy around transgender prisoners. And I think that showed that she was on the way out. We didn't expect it to happen quite as quickly as it did, but I think we saw that her leadership was faltering over issues like this, and it was a slippery slope for her, really.
Now, some are suggesting that Kate Forbes, who is the SNP Finance Secretary, she's been away on maternity leave. Now, she could, some are suggesting, enter the race to actually succeed Sturgeon and reverse the gender ID reforms. I don't think she's formally said that, this is her plans, but she's supposed to be privately opposed to them. And I think it's fair to say, as you've just set out, that these reforms could have actually harmed the SNP electorally. They aren't popular in Scotland, but Forbes is a devout Christian and doesn't believe in these kinds of really quite radical reforms that change the relationship of sex-based rights with sex and gender and all the rest of it. But I was struck by Kate Forbes being put forward because, Michael, she's 32. I mean, that's one hell of a job, isn't it, for a 32-year-old?
Yes, indeed, and it was the same when she became the finance secretary. It was a huge job for her to get at such a young age, such a key role. I actually remember she got the job when there was a scandal around Derek Mackay, and she got the job on the morning of the budget. So a few hours into the
Yes.
job, she needed to deliver a budget, which is a pretty big ask. But I mean, Kate Forbes is actually a really interesting figure. She does reach across the political divide a bit more than what you see from a lot of SNP ministers. So she would be an interesting candidate. I'm not really sure whether the SNP membership would be that enthusiastic about her leadership. So that's one of the things that will be interesting. Certainly, gender reform being one of the issues that we're going to hear all about all the way through this election campaign. So if she does put herself forward, as I think she will, it will be interesting. I'm not certain that she is the SNP establishment pick
Yeah.
for a candidate. I think there might be other candidates like the Health Secretary Hamza Yusuf who might get the Nicola Sturgeon establishment backing him perhaps.
Do you sort of see similarities between the election of Liz Truss from the Conservative Party membership rank and file and the potential election of someone like Hamza Yusuf? Because, as you've just said out there, someone like Kate Forbes could potentially reach out beyond maybe a bit of the soft unionist vote, right? Not just hold on to SNP supporters and voters anyway, but actually reach out across the political divide. I don't think someone like Hamza Yusuf could actually bridge that gap. I think he would be quite a divisive character because he's basically continuity Sturgeon, is he not?
Yeah, and I think that's the like what we saw with Rishi Sunak. He was in the leadership contest against Liz Truss. He was really popular amongst the politicians, but then not so popular amongst the members. So perhaps that would be a problem for Hamza Yusuf as well. I also think it wouldn't surprise me at all if we get a surprise candidate because there's probably some of the names that are mentioned: Hamza Yusuf, Angus Robertson, uh, Kate Forbes. There's probably not a candidate that reflects the really hardcore nationalist
Yeah.
element within that. You know, the people that want to instantly declare independence, to make everything about independence, to completely focus on that and nothing else. So it wouldn't surprise me if somebody comes out to try to win that wing of the party. Perhaps the Justice Secretary and SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown might be somebody who proves popular amongst the grassroots members if he does decide to put his name forward.
Because that is another factor, isn't it? That the downfall of Sturgeon, the fact that there is a base that is absolutely hungry for Scottish independence. Now, I wonder, Michael, where does that movement go now? Because does this get to a point where if there is no candidate that says, right, yes, I can secure you independence right now, I'll be holding an potentially illegitimate referendum? Do we see civil disobedience of the sort in Catalan, for example? Do we see an illegitimate referendum being pledged to win the SNP membership? Do we see tartan-clad sort of gilets jaunes taken to the streets like we saw in France? How do you see this playing out? Do you get the sense that nationalism in Scotland is becoming tired, it's becoming irritable, and actually that's partly not only responsible for the downfall of Sturgeon, but also going to be a key factor in this leadership election?
Yeah, it's certainly a threat to the SNP, the fact that there's maybe a disgruntled faction within the party that just think that Nicola Sturgeon really didn't push the case for independence enough. She didn't grow support for independence enough. It is notable that the recent polling that we've had has suggested that support for independence is at or slightly below where it was in the 2014 independence referendum. So it could be argued that in her time as First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has completely failed to increase support for independence. So if there's a faction within the SNP that are unhappy about that, then that's possibly a threat to the next leader. I'm not really sure that there's anywhere for them to go, though.
Hmm.
I don't think there's going to be any mass movement of voters from SNP to Alex Salmond's Alba party, for example. So you probably you look at these kind of voters and you sort of think if they are completely determined for independence and that's the top priority for them, who else are they really going to vote for other than the SNP? So that's one of the things that helps the SNP's election prospects is that the mass, however many people that might be, perhaps about 20% of the country, who are absolutely huge pro-independence supporters, they're always going to vote for the SNP. So that's a head start in an election for them.
And how do you? I guess with the Alba is an interesting question mark because I imagine, depending on who the candidate is, depending on who the successor to Nicola Sturgeon is, could you see Alba MPs start to come, Alba party representatives start to come back to the SNP? Because I think the SNP have said, look, if you do come back, you're not going to get a vote in this leadership election. So does that suggest that there are already some Alba talking heads or party representatives who are thinking it might be safe to go back home almost?
Well, that will be the next leader will determine that. Suppose. I mean, Kenny McCaskill is Alba MP, former Justice Secretary, well-known figure in the SNP, but it does feel a little bit like he's burned his bridges with the
Mm-hmm.
SNP. It would be pretty difficult to see him return. Certainly, if it's a continuity Sturgeon candidate that wins the leadership race, I couldn't see Kenny McCaskill returning. Neil Hanvey is the other one who was a SNP MP and then quit for Alba. I don't think there will be a return of these figures, but it was interesting that one of the potential leadership candidates, Ash Regan, was talking about trying to get anybody who had left in the last year to be allowed to rejoin the party and take part in the leadership contest. So that was obviously an attempt to get some of the gender reform rebels back in the party, and Alba have benefited from a lot of that
And Ash Regan, of
rebellion.
course, resigned, didn't she, from government over
Yeah.
the gender ID legislation. And someone that's been very vocal on this as well, but has ruled herself out from standing. And I actually think she's a very impressive politician, Joanna Cherry, KC. Now, Joanna Cherry, as I say, ruled herself out from standing in that election. But how do you actually bring people like Joanna Cherry back into the fold? Because it does strike me that one of the perhaps more unspoken elements of the SNP at the moment have been this internal civil war, right? Where you've got MPs like Joanna Cherry who are saying that they don't feel entirely comfortable being, in that party at that moment. I'm wondering, do you see is that going to be able to be fixed easily, or do they start fighting like sort of cats in a sack?
Yeah, I mean, we have already been seeing that Joanna Cherry has had a pretty torrid time in the
Yeah.
SNP since she was sacked from the front bench because of her views, her public views about gender reform. So we have probably one of the most talented SNP politicians who's a backbencher at Westminster and could certainly contribute more to the party. And she has a lot of support amongst not just those who oppose gender reform, but also within the independence campaign. I think a lot of people see her as representing their views. So she's not going to stand, but I think Joanna Cherry will play a pretty important part in this leadership contest because whoever she backs is going to get quite a big boost from that. I think there's a lot of grassroots members that would support whoever Joanna Cherry backs. I think she will be considering between Kate Forbes and Ash Regan,
Hmm.
it wouldn't surprise me if she does end up backing Kate Forbes. So that could be a significant part of the campaign.
But it's a problem ultimately because, most people listening to us speak to each other right now, Michael, won't have heard of either of these people. Kate, I don't even think, even in Scotland itself, I don't think Kate Forbes and Ash Regan are particularly household names, are they?
Yeah, and that is exactly the problem for the SNP. There's been absolutely no attempt to find a successor to Nicola Sturgeon. You would have thought that there would have been somebody that would be pushed forward a bit more. It was always clear that Nicola Sturgeon was going to go probably before the next Scottish Parliament election. So it seems surprising. Why has there not been more of an effort to boost the profile of some of these other ministers in order to give them a chance of taking over and doing well. So that seems like a bit of a feeling of the SNP. And of course, these ministers, the problem that they have is that Nicola Sturgeon is such a dominant figure in
Hmm.
the SNP. It was all about Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon wanted to announce all the big policy announcements. She wanted to do her every government press conference herself. So that makes it really difficult to find a successor who's going to be doing well from the start.
Yeah, because I mean, I've watched a few press conferences with Nicola Sturgeon recently, and I find her to be very tetchy with the press, right? So I feel like her relationship with the press has become a bit fractious in and of itself. I mean, you had the whole questioning around this donation that was made by a husband to the Scottish National Party. You had, of course, as we've already mentioned, the gender ID reforms and the way in which, male bodied people were going into single sex spaces like female prisons with some of the most vulnerable women across Scottish society. Now, all of these things have been, I think it's fair to say, would feel like an attrition for any politician. But Nicola Sturgeon has always seemed unflappable. I've actually met her before, and she is. I will say this: I disagree with her politics vehemently, but I think she is a very, very talented politician. So I was watching this press conference where she resigned, and I found it quite extraordinary. And what I can't understand, what I still don't really understand, is why now, right? It strikes me that there's more to this than Nicola Sturgeon saying, "Oh well, I have relatives of mine who were children when I started this, and now they're 16-year-olds." And you think, well, yes, that's called the passage of time, Nicola. I don't think that's anything quite so profound as you might seek to set out there. Do you see there being what's your take on why, just why now?
Yeah. So why now? There's a few factors. I mean, certainly there were two big issues on the way, which Nicola Sturgeon had really big decisions to make about. So there was whether to press ahead with this fairly ludicrous plan of trying to turn the general election into a de facto referendum and declaring independence if the SNP and pro-independence parties get a majority of the votes. I think that strategy seemed a fairly desperate strategy, which was never really going to work, and also was potentially the end of her leadership because if they failed to win the seats that she says that they need to win, the votes that she says they need to win, then surely she'd need to resign. So that was a big problem in the pipeline, and the gender reform thing as well. It was a big choice between after the UK government blocked the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill. She had this big decision of whether to challenge this in the courts. She's already had some big court defeats at huge expense to taxpayers, and I think another court defeat at expense to taxpayers would be pretty damaging for her, especially on an issue which, even if she won, she would need to be bringing forward a bill that people don't like. So those were the two biggest factors, but certainly there are questions about this police investigation as well. So, Police Scotland is currently investigating a £600,000 independence fund that was raised from donations from party members for the cause of independence, and there's been complaints alleging that this has been spent in other areas. While all this was happening, there was this strange situation where Peter Murrell, her husband and the SNP chief executive, gave a loan of £107,000 to the SNP because it was facing a bit of a cash crisis. So the opponents are saying that this is all murky business, murky finances, and there was every possibility that Nicola Sturgeon and her husband may be or may even have been interviewed by police over this. So these are probably three big factors that might lie behind her resignation.
Yeah, and it strikes me, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, please do, but it strikes me that were this Boris Johnson and Carrie Symonds, his wife, had given a £107,000 donation to the Conservative Party, it would be splashed on all the papers. You know, they would be saying, hell and come hell or high water. You know, we need to get to the bottom of all of this. But I don't think most people, certainly in England, will have heard of any of this. Has it been frustrating for you in your career? The lack of, and I certainly don't make this accusation at the Daily Mail, but the lack of scrutiny of politics and government in Scotland, because on so many issues, and actually that leads me on to the final question that we'll answer after this one, but the question of Nicola Sturgeon's legacy on the economy, on the ferry scandal, education, law and order, drugs. There are so many ways in which I don't think you can point to many policy outcomes and say Nicola Sturgeon has been an unapologetic success story. Do you worry about the lack of holding to account of the Scottish government and I guess their Green coalition partners as well?
Well, I don't really think that that is a problem. I mean, I
Okay.
think a lot of the failings of the SNP are highlighted by the press. And Nicola Sturgeon does come under quite a lot of pressure at First Minister's questions, for example, over the amount of times it's such a regular theme that you'll get NHS, education, the ferries fiasco, all of these issues she's regularly pressed on. What I think is quite interesting about it is that you read some of the polling, and people are asked about the Scottish government's performance on health, education, the economy, and they score them pretty negatively. But then they're asked who are they going to vote for, and they answer SNP. So I'm not really sure why that's the case. How can people who criticise the performance of the SNP government still vote SNP? It's a confusing issue which you perhaps wouldn't see if the Conservative government is doing really badly. You would expect them to lose a lot of votes, but that doesn't seem to always be the case in Scotland with the SNP.
Yeah. Now, on that question, then, to bring the proceedings to a close, then, I guess Nicola Sturgeon's legacy. If you, Michael, if Nicola Sturgeon approaches you and she says, "Look, I want you to be the ghostwriter of my memoirs, Prince
I
Harry
don't think it's
style,"
going to happen.
say she does. What do you write about? What do you say, right? Because as we've been through a whole list of things, that sort of sum up Nicola Sturgeon. And other than winning elections and being the first female First Minister and SNP party leader, I struggle to see what Nicola Sturgeon will actually go down in the history books for.
Yeah, and that was interesting in her resignation speech because you would expect in a resignation speech that you would list all of your successes in all of the areas that you work in, but that really wasn't the case with Nicola Sturgeon. It seemed to me that perhaps she wants her legacy to be her handling of the coronavirus pandemic. That was certainly something that she mentioned. in her resignation speech, and indeed she talked about the toll that her handling of the coronavirus pandemic took on her. So I think that's ultimately how she'll want to be remembered. She'll want to be seen as somebody who did their best to make the right decisions about a major crisis. And I think she thinks that she performed pretty well at that, and that she presented things better than the Conservative government. Of course, uh, I don't think there was actually much difference in the actual quality of the handling of the COVID pandemic, but there probably was a big difference in the presentation of that. Would furlough have been able to happen had Scotland been an independent country, potentially facing its own financial challenges? So yeah, I mean, I think on those two issues in particular, it is something that the UK government has been able to say this demonstrates the value of the union. So it has been positive for the union in that perspective. There's actually questions to be asked about whether the UK government maybe should have been a bit firmer in making sure that there was a UK-wide approach, especially to lockdown restrictions. It became really difficult to keep on track of what the different restrictions were in different parts of the UK, and you wonder if maybe actually the UK government should have done a bit more of making sure that it was a UK-wide approach